So I'll just start talking. So my name is Jean Swidler. I am a co-chair of the Familial ALS team at I AM ALS. Just very briefly, familial ALS is when there's specific mutations or suspected mutations that go through families and mean that the disease manifests in multiple generations. In my family, it was my great-grandfather was the first one diagnosed with ALS and died from it in 1970. My grandmother died of ALS in 1990, and my mom died of ALS in 2019. I confirmed that I carry the mutation, and the average age of onset in our mutation, which is the most common one, C9orf72, goes between the 20s and the 80s, with the most common onset like 58. So anyway, that's some background on myself, and the perspective of the Familial ALS team is we're really the first group of people looking at the interests of the many thousands of folks who are at risk for developing ALS. Heightened risk. So here's some of our priorities. So the first one, we have a very lawyerly definition of it that is in our email to people. And I think we have one of our teammates on the call. She should feel free to jump in, Sam, who helped describe it. But this more compressed version is pre-manifest care and disease prevention. So I wanted to highlight that in the Alzheimer's community, the NIH does run prevention clinical trials in people at risk of early onset Alzheimer's. So it is something that the NIH has experience in. Separately, I do think that the NIH needs to get their head reset on this a bit. I spoke with Brian Trainer, who is a top NIH expert and a gentleman who discovered the C9orf72 gene. So, he's a brilliant person, but he did not see the need for pre-manifest disease prevention, really. Like, he was like, oh, don't worry about it, basically, and I think that's a very naive way of thinking about it. So I think they really need to get their head on straight about this. And that's, of course, a unique need for the people who are impacted by this. And there are tens of thousands of folks in the US alone who are at risk of developing these diseases. But it's also, I think, very important for the whole entire ALS community, because we are not trying to stop the disease at its earliest points yet. Current clinical trials only recruit folks who have a diagnosis of ALS, even though over the last 5-6 years, they've identified the start of the disease in genetic carriers up to 15 years before classical symptom onset that would warrant a diagnosis. So if there are efficacious drugs, and there is this long prodromal period, it's called, where the disease is active in the body and not yet showing up in very obvious clinical symptoms, why would we not want to see if drugs respond well at that early stage of the disease? And that could perhaps be more instructive about the efficacy of a drug than testing it later in the disease course. And I think that might prove beneficial for drug approvals for the whole community. Once you can show that it does something when the disease is early, it makes sense that it would also do something later on in the disease, although perhaps not quite as dramatically. So that's my pitch for that one. We want an increase in research for those at risk of familial ALS. Right now, the NIH pays for one study in Miami of people at risk of familial ALS, and this really provides the only way of looking at the disease before symptoms are present. And that's really where this disease needs to go, is early diagnosis and treatment. We should not be waiting for intervention for people to have severe disabilities. It doesn't make sense. So we want there to be centers who are doing this research all over the place, not just in Miami. So that's another. The third is better connectivity in C9orf72 research between ALS and FTD and other dementias. So C9orf72, by far the most common disease-causing mutation in ALS, is also by far the most common disease-causing mutation in FTD. And the NIH does a lot of work on FTD, and let's make sure that the scientists in these two communities are connecting and know what's going on with each other. Also, if we're looking at biomarkers, we should look at non-invasive biomarkers as a preference. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the central nervous system in ALS, and doing spinal taps is important. But all things considered, if there's a biomarker candidate in the blood or in speech or in an eye scan or something, I think that should be given priority over a biomarker candidate that's only accessible via spinal taps, especially if we're thinking about lifelong monitoring of the disease. It becomes all the more important to have non-invasive biomarker candidates. Finally, we want whole genome sequencing in all research projects with patient samples, obviously only one per subject or patient. For instance, in my family, they just test for C9orf72. And, now we are known as, my mom's samples, she donated her brain, of course. It's a C9orf72 brain, but did they do a whole genome sequencing on her? Because there's probably other gene mutations involved in these things. So that's our 5 things that we think would be good for the NIH to hear. Sam, I don't know if you have anything to add that I messed up on.
No, you did great. I appreciate the overview.
So I know the ALS problem solvers have a great presentation, so I'll leave it to them unless, Megan, you have anything you think I should clarify.
That was awesome, Jean. Just pointing out here on the slide that there is a link to learn more about the Familial ALS team for anyone who might be interested in joining their work.